Shakespeare, the Biography, by Peter Ackroyd, read by Simon Callow. Volume 2, The Upstart Crow. When Shakespeare arrived in London, there were several familiar venues for theatrical performances. The oldest of them were the inns, or rather large rooms within inns, which would otherwise have been used for meetings or assemblies. There's a belief that inn-yards with covered galleries all around them were the first public theatres, but a moment's consideration reveals the impracticality of such an arrangement. Inn-yards were places where travellers arrived, where horses were tethered, and where supplies were delivered. These are not the ideal circumstances for public performances. The only exception occurred in an inn such as the Black Bull, where there was an extra yard connected to the rear yard by a covered alley. There must have been many more places for performance than are currently known, but a few have been recorded for posterity. The Cross Keys was in Gracechurch Street, where Lord Strange's men performed, and the Bell Inn was on the same street. The Bell Savage was located on Ludgate Hill, the Bull in Bishopsgate Street, and the Boar's Head on the north side of Whitechapel Street, beyond Aldgate. It is not clear how much they resembled theatres rather than inns. It seems likely, given the continuities of London life, that they were close to the early 19th century musical saloons or music halls, where drink or wet money was served to paying customers. Certainly it would be a mistake to think of them as inns that simply put on plays as additional entertainment. The Boar's Head, for example, had erected a permanent theatrical space on its premises, and for the Earl of Worcester's men the house called the Boar's Head is the place they have especially used and do best like of. Some of the earliest companies employed for a stage wooden planks placed across beer barrels that had been roped together. The great companies worked in the inns, and one contemporary described the 2 prose books played at the Bell Savage, where you shall never find a word without wit, never a line without pith, never a letter placed in vain. These are precisely the places where Shakespeare learned his craft at first hand. By the time of Shakespeare's arrival, however, there were at least 4 large structures built as general resorts for entertainment in which the theatre took its place alongside wrestling and bear-baiting. The first ever recorded in London documents, the Red Lion at Mile End, had been constructed in 1567 by John Brain, citizen and grocer, as a financial speculation. Since he was also brother-in-law to James Burbage, there may have been some family interest in profiting from various forms of public entertainment. James Burbage began as a player, but in the changed circumstances of city life he became a noted theatrical entrepreneur and father of the celebrated actor Richard Burbage, who played many of Shakespeare's most important roles. He was one of those skilful businessmen who seemed to sense the movement of the time. The growth of the city and the increasing appetite for urban entertainment presented Brain and Burbage with an opportunity. The Red Lion sounds like an inn, but was in fact a permanent playhouse attached to an old farmhouse. Its stage was 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep. There was a trap-door for special effects, and an 18-foot turret of timber was built above the stage for scenic ascents and descents. The coherence of its design suggests that it was based upon previous models and was therefore not the first of its kind. It is sometimes suggested that the drama before Shakespeare's arrival was coarse and rudimentary, complete with wooden daggers and bladders of ox-blood. But that is not necessarily so. Of course there must have been much trash, as there always has been, but it would be unwise to underestimate the skill and subtlety of early writers and performers. There is no progress or evolution in theatrical matters. The 19th century theatre is signally worse than the 16th century theatre, and plays now lost were no doubt excellent of their kind. The Red Lion was followed by a joint venture between John Brain and James Burbage. They picked another spot outside the city walls in Shoreditch, and there in 1576 erected a public building known as the Theatre. They deliberately chose the name from the Latin theatrum, and may have hoped that the classical connotation would augment the status of their enterprise. They could not have anticipated that the word would take on generic status. It was a large building, with capacity of some 1,500 people seated in 3 levels of galleries around an open yard. The yard was also used by members of the audience, and the stage was set against one side. This fixed stage had a roof supported by pillars and a tiring house at the back that was used for exits, entrances, and changes of costume. It resembled the general shape of all future public theatres of the period, in other words. It became the formal setting for Shakespeare's own plays. Its coherent design again suggests, however, that it was based upon lost originals. It was polygonal in structure, with a tiled roof.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?